They started a world war. Committed mass murder and genocide.
2.819 Insassen.
And after the Nazis were defeated, the world had to decide what to do with the men responsible for some of the worst crimes in history.
Als die Schlacht ihrem Ende entgegenging, stürmte die Rote Armee eine Stadt des Chaos und der rauchenden Trümmer.
The answer was to try something new, something that had never been done before. The Nuremberg Trials were a kind of global courtroom where for the first time ever, leaders were held personally accountable for war crimes and crimes against humanity. The location in the German city of Nuremberg was no coincidence. Nuremberg was the place where the Nazi Party had held massive annual rallies for years, and where it introduced the Nuremberg Laws, the racist anti-Semitic laws that helped lay the groundwork for the Holocaust. That's why the city was so symbolic of the Nazi regime's power and ideology, and that's where it was meant to face justice. At the Nuremberg Palace of Justice in courtroom 600.
Rudolf Hess.
Nein.
Nicht schuldig.
At the start of the trial, in fall of 1945, the Nazi leadership showed no remorse. All of the defendants present in the courtroom pleaded not guilty.
Hereby accused as guilty of crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, Hermann Wilhelm Göring, Rudolf Hess, Joachim von Ribbentrop.
So did justice ultimately prevail? And how much have we actually learned from history? Back in May 1945, Nazi Germany had admitted defeat and surrendered unconditionally to the Allied powers. For the Allies, one thing was clear. The Nazis had to be held accountable for their crimes against millions of people they'd murdered in concentration camps, systematically exterminated, killed through war, starvation, or forced labor. The Allies, the US, UK, France, and the Soviet Union were all in agreement that the main perpetrators had to be brought to trial. At the time, that was completely new territory in international law.
For the first time, we had a truly international court. There had been previous efforts, especially after World War I, but they never really took shape. So this really was the first time in the history of international jurisdiction that we saw an international criminal trial, where international law was applied by an international court.
After lengthy negotiations, on August the 8th, 1945, the four Allied powers agreed in London on the charter for the newly created International Military Tribunal. One of its key features was that perpetrators could be prosecuted regardless of where the crimes took place. Another crucial element was the idea of individual responsibility.
When it came to wars of aggression or conspiring to wage a war of aggression, there were rules saying that was prohibited. But we still didn't have any rules that established personal criminal liability. So a figure like Hermann Göring might have assumed and even relied on the idea that Germany as a state for which he was acting could be held responsible, but not him personally.
The idea was that the Nuremberg trials weren't about revenge, but about making sure the truth came out, about holding the perpetrators accountable through a fair legal process, and about showing the world that crimes like theirs wouldn't go ignored.
180 Kinder. 52 davon sind noch nicht 8 Jahre.
The evidence was harrowing. Film footage of unimaginable suffering from concentration camps, survivors' testimony, letters and orders issued by the defendants that showed their direct involvement in a war of aggression, massacres, and genocide.
On voyait les tas de cadavres empilés dans la cour, et de temps en temps, une main ou une tête bougeait parmi ces cadavres, essayant de se dégager.
For the first time, the world saw what had actually happened in the camps at Dachau, Buchenwald, and Bergen-Belsen. But instead of taking responsibility, some defendants appeared dismissive. They claimed they didn't know about the Holocaust, the Nazis' murder of 6 million European Jews. Hermann Göring, Hitler's longtime number 2, who was responsible for building the first concentration camps, claimed he had no idea the Holocaust had happened.
Soweit es mich betrifft, habe ich gesagt, dass
I already have said that not even approximately did I know to what degree this thing took place.
You did not know to what degree, but you knew there was a policy that aimed at the liquidation of the Jews.
Nein, auf die Auswanderung der Juden und nicht auf ihre
No,
Ausrottung.
not liquidation of the Jews. I only knew that certain perpetrations had taken place.
The defendants painted Hitler as a manipulative leader who had led them astray. They tried to blame him for everything.
Sein Gang wurde mehr und mehr der eines entsetzlichen Abenteurers, ohne Gewissen und Ehrlichkeit.
Those were the words of Hans Frank, Governor General of occupied Poland, who oversaw the deportation of at least 1 million Poles sent to do forced labor in German factories, Jews being forced to live in ghettos, and the murder of millions.
Durch von mir angeordnete Maßnahmen ist kein Mensch ums Leben gekommen. Fremdes Eigentum habe ich stets geachtet. Immer war ich darauf bedacht, Menschen in der Not zu helfen und ihnen soweit es in meinen Kräften stand, Glück und Freude in ihr Dasein zu bringen.
That was Walter Funk, Hitler's personal press chief. As a member of the Council of Ministers for Defense of the Reich, he was responsible for Nazi Germany's war economy. As Reich Minister of Economics and president of the Reichsbank, he helped confiscate Jewish citizens' money and property. Also on trial, Julius Streicher, a fanatical anti-Semite and publisher of the hate-filled tabloid Der Stürmer, which for years had spread Nazi propaganda that would help pave the way for the Holocaust. He also blamed Hitler.
Die Massentötungen sind ausschließlich und ohne Beeinflussung auf Befehl des Staatsführers Adolf Hitler erfolgt.
Most Germans followed the first Nuremberg trial closely. Generally, they agreed that it was these top-ranking Nazi officials who were responsible for the atrocities, not the low and mid-ranking Nazis that made up so much of German society.
In the beginning, the Germans not only understood but fully supported the idea of holding war criminals accountable. The main war crimes trial in Nuremberg had broad public backing, but that's exactly where the problem began. Once those top perpetrators were sentenced, most Germans thought, okay, we've got the real culprits now. That's enough. But later trials went much deeper into different elite sectors of society. They put lawyers, doctors, diplomats, business leaders, and others under the microscope. Those trials hit a lot closer to home. Suddenly, there was the question, how far did responsibility for Nazi crimes really go? And then it wasn't just Göring, Keitel, the Wehrmacht, Himmler, and of course Hitler, who were supposed to have led the German people astray. Now the burden of guilt was being spread more broadly. And that was something most Germans weren't ready to accept.
Was interessant ist,
the Nuremberg trials shaped a certain narrative within German society. And that narrative was reinforced by the media. Just as almost all the defendants kept repeating during the trials, it was a small clique around Adolf Hitler who were to blame. Everyone else had just been following orders. They bore no guilt. That rejection of personal guilt carried over into the wider public. A kind of victim narrative took hold. We were the victims of the small clique around Hitler. That was a very common interpretation of the Nazi dictatorship in the 1950s and 60s.
After 218 trial days, more than 230 witnesses, and over 16,000 pages of transcripts, the first Nuremberg trial came to an end on October 1st, 1946. 12 of the defendants were sentenced to death, 7 to prison, and 3 were acquitted.
If you were to say of these men that they are not guilty, it would be as true to say that there has been no war, that there are no slain, that there has been no crime.
The central leadership of the Nazi Party, as well as the SS, the SD, the Nazi Security Service, and the Gestapo, were declared criminal organizations. It took another 2 weeks before the executions. Strict security was in place to prevent any escapes. But there was a kind of escape. Hermann Göring took his own life in his cell, avoiding accountability once again, just like he had during the trial. Following the main war crimes trial, 12 additional follow-up trials were held by U.S. military courts up until 1949. They included trials of doctors, lawyers, industrialists, and members of the Nazi mobile killing units.
If we think of courtroom 600 in the Nuremberg Palace of Justice in 1945 as the birthplace of international criminal law, then we can draw a direct line from there to the UN War Crimes Tribunals in the 1990s, to the establishment of the International Criminal Court in 1998, which then began work in 2002.
The Nuremberg trials were a key milestone in creating international criminal law, a legal system that can hold individuals accountable for the actions of a state. But there's a lot of disappointment and criticism over the trial's legacy. Back in 1945, people believed that the legal standards applied in Nuremberg would later apply to everyone, even the victors. But it took the end of the Cold War to finally make the International Criminal Court in The Hague possible.
The disappointment was huge, especially when during the Vietnam War and other conflicts it became clear that the rules established in Nuremberg weren't actually being enforced. The judges and prosecutors back then didn't end up on trial themselves, even though later conflicts might have warranted it. So no, we didn't get consistent enforcement of international criminal law from 1946 onward, and we still don't have it today. That might have been the hope, the aspiration back then. But whether it was ever a realistic expectation, well, that's another question entirely.
Ob das wirklich die Erwartung war, steht natürlich auf einem anderen Blatt.
To this day, there are a number of countries that don't recognize the International Criminal Court in The Hague, or that have even withdrawn their signature from the treaty that created it. The US, Israel, North Korea, and Russia are some of the countries that are not part of the treaty. And even countries that do recognize the court have chosen to ignore arrest warrants, like Mongolia did with Vladimir Putin, or Hungary with Benjamin Netanyahu. Both countries let leaders who are wanted in The Hague travel in and out without arrest. What do you think about the international criminal justice system? Do we need a new one? What would it look like? Let us know your thoughts in the comments.